So in this video, I'm going to just quickly go over the Muscle Solver Vellum and its various parameters. And then in the next video, we can actually look at running a simulation. So if you're familiar with the Vellum solver, you will find a lot of familiar parameters here with a couple of extras. But if you are new to Houdini and Vellum, fear not. I will try to explain it as if everyone is a beginner. Firstly, I previously set all of these values to their lowest values just for the visualizing the guides, but I'm going to reset them to their defaults. I'm just holding down Control, middle mouse clicking to reset their defaults. Okay, so reset simulation, as it implies, will reset the simulation. Start frame, if you work in a production pipeline, perhaps where your start frame is something like 1001, you might want to put something like that value there, although you typically won't have it be at the same frame that your animation will start because you'll want some pre-roll built into it. So it might be something like 990. But if you use the global variable $f_start, this will correspond to the frame at the beginning of your frame range for every shot. So you can, if it varies per shot, this will make sure that it's always correct. And if you also notice, there's also another global parameter called rf_start, which corresponds to this frame, start frame here. So this is the global animation start frame, and this is the start frame. So if you perhaps only want to preview from a certain frame, I probably shouldn't do this with a sim on because that's just going to break everything. But say you only want to play back from frame 10, you can set frame 10 here, even though the internal frame might start at 1. Okay, so this will, in this case, wrong node, in this case, rf_start corresponds to this value, and f_start corresponds to that value. If you go to your global animation options, check off restrict playback range, then you can actually have your rf_start be a value smaller than this. So you could have this be 10 and this be 1. That kind of probably just depends on what sort of workflow you use at your studio. But yes, just be aware that those are options. Let me just reset this back to defaults. Okay. The second order integration is basically it. We can even look at the little, oh no, it doesn't give a good description there. If we create a Vellum solver, we can look at the description for the Vellum. When integrating points forward by the velocities, curve motions like swinging pendulums will be mispredicted and be damped. Blah, blah, blah. Second order predictor recovers more of this curve motion and maintains more energy in the system. So basically, second order is better for pendulum type swinging. In terms of muscles, second order is going to give you a bit more nice jiggle than first order, probably. I haven't tested it, but you might be able to, if you have like if you have too much energy in your system, too much jittering, and you've tried increasing your damping and it hasn't helped, you can try set this to first order. That might help. It's automatically, any points that collide will automatically be set to first order, but only the points that are colliding. Okay, the precision, you only need to worry about setting this to a higher value if your character is far from the origin. And by far from the origin, we're talking about maybe 1,000 meters, anything from that type of value. Subsample bone animation. This depends a little bit on the form that your bone animation is coming in as. If you have something like an alembic file with subframes cached out, it should automatically be reading the subframes in between the main frames. But if you're reading it from just something like a file cache where only single frames are cached out, the subsample will help to just make sure that the bones are still moving on subframes, because these substeps otherwise will just be getting static bones. on the subframes, which we don't want. However, you can also use something like a time blend to have more control over the subsample of your bones outside over here. That brings me to just realize that I don't want rest bones here. That was fine for when I was previewing my constraints on the static muscles, but now I actually want the animate bones. Okay, now the vellum timescale. So most of the time you'll want a timescale of 1. If you have, maybe you have a slow motion shot, then you'll want to reduce the timescale. And if you have like a high motion shot, you can increase the timescale, which might be useful if you have like a superhero type character moving really fast or something like that. I have seen people suggest increasing the timescale to get the muscles to follow the bones better. The physics major in me doesn't like doing unphysical things just to get results. But I guess if it works, it works. But you should be able to get a similar result by reducing various damping values. The time scale, if you increase the time scale, it's going to be essentially equivalent to decreasing the damping and decreasing the mass. If you look at, you might have found some example files online for machine learning, for sort of machine learning skinning muscle sims, where you have incredibly high values for your vellum timescale on the order of 500 or something. That is because for a machine learning type situation where you are just worried about skinning, you are not interested in any secondary motion like jiggle or bounce, anything like that. And pushing the vellum timescale to a very high number like that is equivalent to approaching a sort of quasi-static simulation. So if you see that, just be aware that the reason for that value is because it's for a machine learning type example, and it doesn't, if you are trying to set up a real dynamic simulation with nice jiggly secondary motion type stuff on your muscles, setting your time scale to 500 is going to make life very difficult for you. Then we have the vellum substeps. This is maybe the most important setting on the solver. So this is obviously the number of steps each frame of the simulation is divided into. So for a value of 2, it means it's going to divide the frame into 2. So it will sample once at the beginning and once at the middle, I believe. I might be wrong. I should double check that. But basically, each additional substep is going to increase the number of subframes it simulates on. So it will increase your simulation time, but it will also improve your accuracy. And it also helps not just accuracy in terms of collisions, but it also helps often for getting your constraints to converge. And by that, it means for the constraints to actually be obeyed fully by the solver. So if you have a constraint with a very high stiffness value and the results of your simulation still seems very stretchy, which you wouldn't expect for the constraint values you have, then you might have to increase your substeps to get those constraints to converge. Now, I know in the early days of Vellum, we were told to increase the constraint iterations to get the constraints to converge. And I think in theory that's still true, but it is generally recommended nowadays to increase your substeps rather than increase your constraint iterations. And the same for your collision passes. It's quite expensive, so it's better to increase substeps rather than your collision passes. So the collision passes are the number of times it's going to try and resolve collisions per substep. And part of the reason why collisions are expensive is because it needs to look up collisions with every point in the collider. So a way to reduce collision expense is to reduce the number of points in your incoming bones. The smoothing iterations, these kind of go hand in hand with the constraint iterations. If you have your constraint iterations a lot higher, you need to up your smoothing iterations to balance it out. To be honest, I generally don't really tweak these values. I generally go with substeps. That's all. thing. The post-collision passes are for final collisions. The polish passes, these are quite a bit cheaper because they're only done on points that are already known to be collisions. So it's not doing a full lookup of collisions each substep. So, and this can help to resolve collisions that have been detected but haven't yet been resolved. Now for the constraints, I feel like I've covered this pretty well when I covered the muscle constraint properties node because they go hand in hand. Just to clarify, I suggested turning off the muscle to bone and the muscle to muscle. And that's just for testing. Actually, not the muscle to muscle. I only suggest turning off the muscle to bone. And that's just for testing because the muscle to bone constraints can often kill a lot of other settings like your jiggle and bounce and flexing and bulging and things like that. If you are tweaking your muscle parameters, your muscle properties, and you don't realize that you have very high values for your muscle to bone, you can be tweaking these properties and not seeing any difference and getting really frustrated and saying, why do these properties even exist if they don't do anything? Not realizing that it's all just being killed by the muscle to bone constraint. So that's why I suggest when you start off to disable the muscle to bone constraint just to get a feel for how those properties behave without it on, and then turning it on and seeing how it changes. And then you can maybe reduce your muscle to bone stiffness, for instance, so that more of that sort of bulging, flexing, jiggling motion gets preserved. But we'll go over that in the next video too. Then the rest position, this should be fairly straightforward if you're just using the T-pose attribute that gets created by the muscle solidify node. You should just be able to use that. The bone T-pose attribute will, hopefully, if you followed my instructions, also be T-pose. If you gave this some other funny name for whatever reason, then you will just use whatever funny name you used there over here. Then the activation attributes. These are, I feel like this can be a little bit confusing what this means because you think, oh, contraction, bulge, shape, is this going to control the shape of my bulging? And so remember, these are just activation attributes, okay? Which means it's basically just saying, controlling when the muscle contracts and doesn't contract, when the muscle bulges and doesn't bulge, when the muscle changes to a target shape and when it doesn't. So I'll have an advanced video on the target shape workflow. And there is also on the side effects website under the content library, there is an example file for how you could vary these. In most situations, you probably wouldn't want to vary it from what these are, but basically what you can do is you can create a muscle flex node for each of these properties so that you can either by hand key different values or with tension lines key different values to vary to independently control when the muscle's contracting, when it's bulging, and when it reaches the target shape. And to clarify, the contraction is going to be how much the fibers are shortening, and that corresponds to this fiber strength. The bulge, so this contraction will already give a little bit of bulge just because of the volume preservation that you do get to a certain extent from the solver. But like I mentioned before, you don't get perfect volume preservation, which is why we have this extra fiber volume scale parameter to bulge a bit extra when the muscle is, well, in theory when it's contracting, but you can basically make it happen whenever if you decouple it from the muscle tension attribute. So if you have a separate attribute that says bulge when the disco light turns on, then what this basically does is it controls this, fiber volume scale, right? So it hasn't got anything to do with if your fiber volume scale is set to 1, then animating this bulge is not going to do anything. It's only going to do something if your fiber volume scale is greater than 1. And then the shape is if you have a target shape attribute for the muscles. So usually you would want the target shape to be activated when the muscle is contracting. But if you want to decouple those, then you can have a different attribute here to drive it. And you would generally create that attribute with the muscle flex and then just give it a different name at the top here and use that corresponding name over here. Same for the bulge. In addition, this is a good time to talk about the third input option for the muscle solver, the activation attribute reference. So this is optional. I would guess that 95% of people won't use this, but basically if you have, you can have your animation muscles come in the first stream, and then in the third input you can have something like a rest muscles perhaps, and it doesn't have to be rest, but they just have to have the same point count and point order as the first input. But then if you specify a third input, then it's going to grab these, whatever attributes you specify here, it will grab from the third input instead of the first input. But when you don't have a third input in, then it will just grab those attributes from the first input. So the activation attributes, if they exist on the first input, will be used, but only if you have your activation attributes on a separate stream of geometry for whatever reason. Perhaps your studio does animation, actually exports animated muscles as part of its, the muscles have weights and they're exported, and you don't want to use the muscle flex to animate the muscles. You just want to use the muscle flex to get the activation values. So in that case, you will have your, let's just pretend that this is my animated muscles that I've got for the shot. That will come in your first input, and then your muscle flex will come in your third input. If you have a target shape attribute and you have a third input connected, it will grab it from the third input instead of the first input. But most of the time, if you don't care, if you are happy to just use the animation that's created by the muscle flex node, then you should be fine to use the muscle flex as your first input, and just make sure that all the activation attributes and target shape attribute is all just on the first input. So this is a fairly advanced thing, and fairly niche thing. Forces. Gravity, I hope, is self-explanatory. I suggest not changing it unless you are simming a character in space or on a different planet, or perhaps underwater or something. Drag is your air drag. So it says wind drag, but you don't need to have wind per se for the air drag to work. Then the velocity damping. I think this description is a little bit misleading, so I'll try and change it in the future. But basically, it's the exact same velocity damping value parameter as on the Vellum solver. And for the Vellum solver, where is it? The description for velocity damping is, it's a brute force approach to reduce dynamic velocity. The velocity is scaled directly by this amount, causing sudden movements to be quickly dampened. So basically, it's a way of damping sudden movements. And it's going to do the same thing here. It will, of course, be relative to the bones, because the motion of the bones won't be damped, because that's kind of absolute. It's not part of the solver. But what I thought, I'm not even going to get into why I found this confusing, but basically it's going to reduce sudden changes in velocity. And then simulation cache is just memory usage. And this little blue bar at the bottom, as I run my simulation, you'll see this blue bar indicates how many frames are cached. And if you find, so for this frame range and for these settings, it will generally keep the cache for the whole frame range. But if you have, if you find that it doesn't keep it for the entire range and you have enough memory to do so, you can increase the memory. Or if it's using up too much memory and you don't need it to keep the cache for as many frames, you can reduce that. The collisions tab. So by default, it's set to the following. So muscle to muscle collisions are on, bone collisions are on, self collisions are off, and ignore collisions with muscle anterior points are off. So basically, self collisions is for a muscle with itself. So if something causes the muscle to fold on itself weirdly or something, and it ends up colliding, then you'll want to probably turn on self collisions to prevent that. But it does, of course, make it more expensive. So if you can get away without it, then that's good. Muscle to muscle collisions is obviously between one muscle and another. Bone collisions, I hope, is self-explanatory. Then ignore collisions with muscle interior points. So remember, these muscles are tetrahedra, and there are points on the surface as well as points inside the volume. So basically, if this gets turned on, it means all the internal points will be disabled, and their collisions will be disabled, so they won't try to collide with anything. And if they're in their default setting, they do. A situation where you might want to turn this on is if you're using maybe your whole skin is a Franken muscle and you have bones inside it, and you don't want the bones to collide with the interior points of that big Franken muscle. The bone collision radius, I like the description here that it is a radius bubble, like a force field around the bones. So yes, it will make sure it will give a bit of a buffer between the muscles and the bones as a collision thickness. It's good to keep it fairly small. You can reduce it to smaller than this if needed, but I wouldn't suggest making it much bigger. Enable ground plane is if you want to have a ground plane as a collider, and you can set its position if you don't want it in the default position. Multi-pass. To be honest, I've never used this, but I think it's actually very useful, and I'm going to try use it going forward. But what it does is if you enable it, which it's not enabled by default, but if you enable it, it will, up to a maximum number of passes, it will keep trying to fix collisions as needed. So if there aren't any collisions, it's not going to do this many passes. And if the collisions get resolved after 2 passes, it won't continue with the remaining 8, but it will basically keep trying to resolve collisions up to the maximum value number of times. And the way it does this is by looking at neighboring points for disabled collisions. And if they're stretching more than the stretch ratio, then they also get disabled in order to allow like a trapped point to be released. If you want to understand that better, the documentation explains it pretty well. And then external collider, if you want to perhaps collide it with either some sort of non-flat ground plane, some type of environment that is not just a flat plane, you can specify it here. You can also specify it if there's some type of animated geometry, perhaps another character, perhaps, I don't know, like you want to use the skin on the hand if the hand is touching somewhere else and the thickness of the bones isn't enough to compensate for it. So if you have got, if the collider is changing over time in some way, turn on use deforming geometry. If it's just a static environment, you can uncheck that because you only need it to be read in on one frame. And you can look at the documentation for further details about that. The collision radius will be very similar to the bone collision radius in this case. And the guides I've already talked about somewhat. The first thing that I'm going to say is if you're actually running your simulation, it's a good idea to turn off these guides because it does make it a bit slower and more expensive. So you can maybe run it for a few frames and then turn it on to inspect a certain frame or something like that. But don't just leave it on for every time you sim if you're not paying any attention to it. And yes, these have been covered in previous videos, including the collision radius and the disabled collisions. And I believe the collision geometry is going to correspond to if you have an external collider, because the display bones is the main collision geometry, right? And the fiber direction is going to be the one painted in the fiber groom. Well, painted being a strong word, but that one. And you can also set what skin attributes, what point attributes on the muscles you want to display. This shouldn't slow down your sim time, I don't think. It's mainly these ones over here that will slow it down. Okay, great. So those are the settings for your Muscle Solver Vellum, and in the next video we can actually start running some simulations and looking at how we approach that, optimize that, cache it out, tweak different settings to get what we want, etc.